Big Shaq's son sat in the front row, where legacy belonged, until power whispered, and everything shifted. No protest, no scene, just quiet replacement, until the world saw the clip. What followed wasn't outrage, it was a reckoning. And moments later, the entire staff learned, you don't erase a future built by giants. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning air in Atlanta carried a kind of electric optimism. Sunlight poured across the skyline like it was painted on by a divine brush, and the city for once felt like it was breathing in sync. Hopeful, proud, expectant. It was the day of the Unity Through Sport charity event, hosted at the newly branded Cypress Legacy Arena, a glass and steel symbol of modernity and corporate progress. This wasn't just any game, it was meant to be a cultural statement, a gathering of athletes, activists, politicians and philanthropists, all under one gleaming roof, all preaching the same word, unity. And in the middle of it all, stood Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal. A man known worldwide not just for his dominance on the court, but for his heart off it. Today, he wasn't in a suit or jersey, just a clean black polo, dark denim, and that unmistakable presence. He towered, as always, but not just in size, in soul. Cameras followed him, fans waved, and people lined up just to shake his hand. But none of that lit him up the way the boy beside him did. Shaquille O'Neal walked slightly behind his father, hands in his pockets, a subtle smirk playing on his lips. He was 17 but carried himself like someone much older, calm, composed, the kind of kid who'd rather observe than perform. He wasn't trying to ride his father's legacy, he was trying to build his own, quietly. If Shaq was the thunder, Shaqir was the silence just before it. They entered through the south gate, bypassing the crowd, guided by organizers who shook Shaq's hand a little too long and smiled a little too wide. Everything here was polished, the marble-finished lobby, the manicured volunteer greeters, even the corporate banners talking about inclusion and community legacy. It looked like a celebration. It felt like a press release. As they passed through the grand corridor that led to the player suites, Shaq's eyes lingered for a second on a long brass-etched plaque beside the hall. It bore the names of major donors, a roster of suits and surnames. Among them was one that made his stomach knot, Merrick Holdings, a name tied to more than just business in Shaq's memory. His face didn't change, but something in his posture did. He glanced at Shaqir, who was now chatting with a volunteer about where his seat was. It should have felt like a proud moment. Father and son together in the spotlight, at an event where the message was supposed to be bigger than the marketing. But instead, something about the place whispered a warning. Shaq had been in this arena before. Once, as a rookie sitting far up in the rafters with his mother, Lucille O'Neal, who had been denied entrance to the main floor during a college game. "Those seats aren't for us," the usher had said back then. That moment stayed with him. Lucille hadn't cried. She'd smiled, taken his hand and said, "One day you'll own this whole building." And now, nearly 3 decades later, here he was, back in that same building. But something about being back, with Shaqir now walking these halls, made the memory feel loud again. Not painful, just unfinished. Inside the arena, every detail was engineered. Colored LED panels wrapped around the upper ring. Digital banners danced across the jumbotron, and a stream of promo messages buzzed like propaganda. Welcome to progress. Welcome to unity. The event was a hybrid of sport and spectacle. Ex-players, media darlings, rising stars, and corporate partners all playing a friendly exhibition game. Funds raised were going to inner-city education and mentorship programs. It should have been a proud celebration, and for the cameras it was. Shaqir was handed his ticket by an assistant. Seat 1A, front row center court, reserved for VIP family guests. Just 3 seats down from where the mayor was supposed to sit, and right beside a section reserved for Merrick Holdings representatives. "Enjoy, lil' man," the assistant said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Shaq grinned, bumping fists with his son. "Call me if the popcorn's weak." Shaqir laughed, heading toward the lower bowl, unaware that with each step, the air around him was shifting. The security guards at the edge of the VIP section glanced at each other. A woman in a headset whispered into her mic. A man in a blazer with a clipboard frowned as he double-checked the name on a seat chart. Shaq, meanwhile, was ushered to the skybox upstairs, along with a few former NBA greats and press executives. He took one last glance down toward Shaqir, who had just found his seat, and was unwrapping a hot dog like a kid at a ball game. Nothing seemed out of place. Not yet. But behind the scenes, quiet panic had begun to trickle. Just 5 minutes before tip-off, a white couple, older, well-dressed, clearly of some elevated status, arrived at the VIP row. The man was Clayton Merrick, the CEO of Merrick Holdings. His wife wore a designer scarf that shimmered like glass. They were escorted by two staffers who seemed flustered. There was a hushed exchange. The usher looked toward Shakir. Clipboard. Point. Whisper. A fake smile. Another whisper. Shakir looked up, caught the usher's eyes, then glanced toward the couple. He was asked respectfully, politely, to follow the staff member for a quick adjustment. Something about a seating error. Something about reassignment. The staffer's smile was tight, almost afraid. Shakir blinked once, then stood. He didn't cause a scene. He didn't ask questions. Just followed. 1 row, 2 rows, 5, then 11. His new seat was next to the media zone, partially blocked by a camera rig. No one even looked twice as he sat down. The game began. The crowd roared. Merrick clapped loudly from the seat Shakir had just been in. From the skybox, Shaq couldn't see his son anymore. His eyes scanned the section where Shakir should have been. But the seats were crowded. He figured maybe his son had stepped out. Maybe he was with the other kids near the players' tunnel. He smiled and waved at the camera when it panned to him. He gave a quick on-air interview about change and community. Said all the right things. But something inside him was fidgeting. A tickle in his gut. A silence that didn't sit right. Shakir, 11 rows back, watched the game in silence. He heard the cheers. He saw the people laugh. He watched Merrick lean back and sip champagne, feet practically on the wood. No one else knew. No one else cared. And that's when it hit him. He wasn't supposed to be seen there. Not really. He was invited, but only as long as he didn't make anyone uncomfortable. He was welcome, but not really welcome. And it wasn't about basketball. It was about presence. He pulled his hoodie up, looked at his shoes, pressed his hands together to stop them from shaking. It wasn't humiliation. It was erasure. Quiet, polite erasure. And the worst part? He wasn't even surprised. Meanwhile, somewhere in the back of his mind, Shaq was remembering that night decades ago. Lucille's hand on his shoulder. One day, you'll own this building. But today, that building still moved his son like furniture. That was the moment something inside him began to turn. Because the day that was meant to heal, it had just reopened an old wound. Shakir's original seat, 1A, was a perfect view. Dead center, front row, edge of the court. The kind of seat where the sweat from the game occasionally landed near your shoes. For a kid like Shakir, who'd grown up with the game in his blood, but never bathed in his father's spotlight, it felt both earned and humbling. He wasn't trying to be seen. He wasn't even wearing team colors, just a plain gray hoodie and jeans. But there was something sacred about being given that kind of space. It wasn't about status. It was about finally being allowed to belong without proving anything. Shaq was somewhere upstairs, taking interviews with cable news and podcast hosts, talking about how sports could build bridges. The press room buzzed with high-end cameras, LED lighting rigs, and sound bites like unity through purpose and legacy-driven leadership. Shaq held his usual composure, warm, grounded, respected. Even the other athletes deferred to him, the way younger lions give space to the old one that still roars when necessary. Down on the floor, Shakir sat with his elbows on his knees, taking in the pregame drills. He had no entourage, no bodyguard, no media hovering around, just a complimentary Gatorade bottle and a printed event brochure folded twice in his hand. A staff member had even handed him a custom credential badge, laminated, official with his name and seat number in bold print. Shakir O'Neal. 15 minutes before tip-off, the energy in the arena was shifting. Ushers moved more briskly, photographers angled themselves, and a hush fell across the VIP section. That was when they arrived. Clayton Merrick walked in like he owned the court. Because in many ways he did. Crisp navy suit. Tan skin weathered by yacht vacations. Behind him, his wife, Lenora, moved with the kind of elegance that knew velvet ropes always parted for her. They were flanked by 2 junior executives in matching blazers, both nervously scanning the section. Lenora narrowed her eyes toward the front row. Without drama, without even pointing directly, she stopped just behind Shakir's seat. Clayton leaned slightly toward the usher. A whisper, a nod. The usher's hand went to his earpiece. Another nod. Then motion. Subtle. Practiced. A short controlled walk across the carpet toward Shakir. Shakir didn't notice at first. He was too focused on watching one of the point guards practice a behind-the-back pass routine. But he looked up when the usher stopped beside him. "Excuse me, Mr. O'Neill," the usher said, voice even, almost friendly. "There's been a slight adjustment to the seating chart. Mind coming with me for a moment?" Shakir blinked, confused but not alarmed. "Is there a problem?" "Not at all, sir. Just a mix-up with assigned priority placements. We've got a new location for you, just a few rows up." He stood. No anger, no protest. Just the quiet awkwardness of not knowing whether to speak up or let it go. The usher gestured ahead, and they moved up the aisle. Not 2 rows, not 5. 11 rows back. Row 12, near the LED rail, just shy of where the arena lighting began to feel unnatural. Not terrible seats, but nowhere near where he'd been. He was handed a new lanyard, new seat number, new level of silence. The usher gave a short robotic smile. "Thanks for understanding." And then he was gone. Back in seat 1A, Merrick now sat comfortably, legs slightly apart, arms draped over the back of his wife's seat. He didn't even glance back, didn't even pretend to acknowledge the switch. The game began with the usual fanfare, music, dancers, sponsor banners, and no one watching from the nosebleeds would have ever guessed anything out of place had happened. But someone else was watching, unintentionally. On the opposite side of the court, perched in the 3rd row, a young streamer named Jax was live on Twitch, capturing every moment of his inside experience. He wasn't famous, but he had a decent following, just over 40,000 subs, and tonight he was doing a raw no-cut stream from the charity game. His rig was small, a phone, a stabilizer grip, and a wireless mic clipped to his hoodie. He hadn't meant to film the scene, but he had. In perfect audio and wide-angle clarity, Jax's camera had captured the usher quietly moving Shakir, and the Merrick sliding into his seat without a second thought. The exchange didn't look aggressive, but it felt wrong. The vibe was unmistakable. The priority was visibly white. The adjustment was visibly black. Jax, narrating for his live viewers, had muttered, "Yo, what just happened? That's Shaq's kid, ain't it? They just booted him for some rich dude. That's wild." He didn't think much of it at the time, but his chat did. Clips were cut, tweets were made. One follower posted, "Tell me that wasn't what it looked like." Another added, "This is exactly how racism stays invisible. It's never loud. It's always polite." The moment captured unintentionally began quietly catching fire. Back in row 12, Shakir had sunk low in his seat. Hood up. He wasn't crying, but his jaw was tight. Not out of rage, out of something more complicated. Something cold. Not sadness, but disappointment too deep to name. He wasn't unfamiliar with the looks, the passive-aggressive silences. But this was different. This wasn't subtle. This was planned. And worse, it was accepted. He looked at the court but didn't see it. His ears heard the cheers, but they didn't register. Upstairs, Shaq laughed during an interview, slapped another former NBA player on the shoulder, and posed for a photo holding up a signed jersey for charity. His phone buzzed. Once, then again, then 3 times in a row. He ignored it. But something started pulling at him. That old Lucille instinct. He stepped away from the crowd, opened his phone, and tapped into his text threads. Your son just got moved? Is this true? Tell me this is staged." He scrolled, and then he saw the clip. 10 seconds. No edits. No music. No commentary. Just his son. Being moved like a temporary inconvenience. For a name that bought a plaque. Shaq didn't move, didn't speak, but something behind his eyes shifted. The next 30 minutes moved in slow, painful inches. The game went on. The crowd roared. Merrick laughed, charmed a sponsor 2 rows behind him, and passed his wife a glass of stadium Cabernet. Shakir stayed still. Jax's stream, now being clipped and passed like wildfire, reached a journalist at a major sports blog by the time the second quarter hit. The headline that followed wasn't clickbait. It was a bullseye. Shaq's son quietly removed from front row for white exec at Unity game. Caught on stream, and that's when the ripple turned into a current. Fans on Twitter began tagging Shaq's official handle, then TNT Sports, then the arena itself. One clip was retweeted by a college professor with a caption, "If racism had a modern-day suit, this is what it'd look like." In real time, the game was still being played, points still being scored, Halftime act still performing, but the real story had already started, and it wasn't on the scoreboard. Back in the press suite, Shaq looked down at the court, looked at where his son should have been. Then he looked at where he was. And then, he left the room. Not with anger, but with purpose. Outside, reporters tried to follow, but he said nothing. Security offered to escort him. He declined. His stride didn't break. His mind didn't wander. His destination wasn't public. He didn't go to the VIP lounge. He didn't confront Merrick on the court. He didn't demand a spotlight moment. Instead, he walked straight to the event coordinator's private room, a steel and glass office tucked behind the executive suite. He didn't knock. He walked in. What was said behind that door wasn't caught on camera, but what happened after it would change everything. Because that one seat, that wasn't just about sitting. That was about seeing who still thought they had the right to decide who belongs in the front. And the world had just watched them get it wrong. The sound inside Cypress Legacy Arena grew louder as the game picked up pace. But for Shaquille O'Neal, each roar of the crowd only pushed him deeper into silence. He sat still in row 12, his hands clasped, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the floor rather than the court. The lights no longer dazzled. The music felt hollow. Even the game, that sacred rhythm of sneakers, whistles, and momentum, seemed muffled under the weight of what had happened just minutes ago. 11 rows back from where he was supposed to be, Shakir didn't say a word to anyone. He didn't turn to the person beside him, didn't pull out his phone, didn't even blink when the Jumbotron flashed celebratory player stats overhead. His silence wasn't just internal, it was invisible, because the crowd wasn't watching him anymore. Nobody was. Except the cameras had never left his name. Above the court, the Jumbotron's live display scrolled a list of special guests seated courtside. Names appeared in elegant typography with seat designations beside them, a little branding detail to highlight the arena's elite attendees. And right there, bold and center, the list scrolled again. Shaquille O'Neal. Seat 1. The arena hadn't updated it. His name remained in the exact spot where his body no longer was. The seat had been taken. The name had not. Meanwhile, in seat 1A, Clayton Merrick leaned comfortably into the plush leather chair, sipping from a flute of sparkling wine, as though nothing had happened. He laughed, adjusted his cufflinks, and whispered something into his wife's ear, who let out a soft chuckle and tilted her head back. They looked like the image of power, practiced, polished, unapologetic. The staff around them remained professional, but a subtle shift in energy lingered. Some glanced nervously at the seat. A few looked away quickly when they realized whose name still flashed above it. But no one spoke up. After all, the game was live. The optics were clean. And mistakes like this? They're just part of big events. That's how they'd rationalize it later. In row 12, Shakir stood up slowly. No dramatic exit. No head turns. He simply adjusted the strap on his hoodie, nodded slightly to the court like a player leaving warm-up, and turned toward the aisle. He walked the concourse tunnel alone. No cameras followed. No ushers tried to stop him. No fans called his name. And that's what stung the most. Because even in the house built to honor athletes like his father, even with his name on the list, even with a badge around his neck, he was unseen. Back upstairs, Shaq's team had started to notice. Shaq had returned to his skybox after confronting the event coordinator. His face was unreadable, carved from something colder than anger. He hadn't told anyone what was said in that room, only that he was going back up. But when he scanned the court, he found nothing but unfamiliar faces. One of his security team, Benton, leaned in. "You seen Shakir?" Shaq didn't answer at first. "Thought he was courtside," Benton continued. "Camera hasn't panned to him. You want me to check?" Shaq's eyes narrowed. "Do it." Benton moved quickly, cutting through the luxury suite traffic and stepping out into the corridor. He radioed another team member near the player tunnels. The back and forth started calmly. Just another moment of coordination. But after 2 minutes, Benton's pace picked up. Another 5. And he was back in the box, face tighter. He's not in 1A. He's not in the side zones. Nobody's seen him for over 20 minutes. Shaq's chest stiffened. And? The weird part, they've still got his name on the Jumbotron. Seat 1A. But it's some other guy sitting there. White. Suit. Older. Shaq stood slowly. "Where's my son?" Benton didn't have an answer. Downstairs, Shakir had made his way to the parking deck. Not the VIP exit, but the lower-level ramp, where catering trucks and temporary staff filtered in and out unnoticed. He wasn't sneaking out. He just wasn't waiting for another usher to redirect him. His badge hung low around his neck, his hoodie now shadowed most of his face. As he walked, the buzz of the arena faded behind him, replaced by the hum of generators and the distant echo of traffic. He pulled his phone out briefly, stared at the lock screen, a photo of him and Shaq fishing on Lake Lanier last spring, then shoved it back into his pocket. He didn't want to text his dad. Not now, not when the story would hurt him too. Because that's what this really was. It wasn't about a seat, it was about what the seat meant. It meant that people still believed there was a hierarchy, not of status or contribution, but of worth. That even now, with all the speeches and sponsorships and scholarship drives, there were still rooms where power moved one way, and made sure it stayed that way. Shakir found a bench near the loading dock, and sat down. He wasn't crying, but something inside him was unraveling. Not in flames, but in a quiet, devastating folding. A soft erasure of belief that maybe, just maybe, this generation was supposed to be different. He had believed the posters, the hashtags, the future is equal campaigns, but the future still had someone else's name on the chair. Inside the arena, panic had begun to ripple. Shaq wasn't yelling, but his voice carried. He was now walking the lower concourse with Benton and two staffers from the event's operations team. He's not answering his phone, Shaq said flatly. He's not in the building. You moved him. Now tell me where. The event coordinator stammered. We had a miscommunication with seat assignments. But he's still listed. We never removed his badge. It's possible he just... You left his name in the seat you gave to somebody else, Shaq interrupted. You moved my son and left his name in the damn chair like a trophy. That's not a mix-up. That's a message. A silence thickened around them. Shaq turned to Benton. Check the garage cameras. Minutes later, footage confirmed it. Shakir had walked out through the service deck, alone, unbothered, unseen. No security escort. No staff acknowledgement. Not even a courtesy check. Back in the arena, the third quarter started. The crowd remained unaware of the storm building beneath the surface. On social media, however, the conversation was heating. Screenshots of the Jumbotron listing Shakir's name were now placed side by side with livestream clips of Merrick occupying his seat. People began tagging the arena, the sponsors, the event itself. A sports journalist tweeted, "They gave his seat to someone else but kept his name on it. If that doesn't define performative inclusion, I don't know what does." Another followed with, "Unity looks great on paper, but watch who they still ask to move when power walks in." By the end of the quarter, the live stream footage had hit 2.1 million views, and the arena still hadn't updated the Jumbotron. Shakir sat outside in the breeze, staring at a cracked piece of pavement near the curb. A maintenance truck pulled up. The driver stepped out, gave him a casual nod. Shakir nodded back. The driver didn't recognize him. He was just another kid in a hoodie. That was the piece of it. And the pain. He didn't want to be recognized because of his last name, but he did want to be respected for his place. And tonight, both had been taken. Back inside, Shaq stood still in the dim hallway just beyond the press corridor. The cheers echoed through the walls like a different world entirely. He took a deep breath, placed a call to his assistant. "Don't speak. Just listen," he said. "I want every name on that seating chart. I want their companies. I want who moved what, when, and why. I want footage pulled, chain of command traced, and I want it quiet. You understand me? Not loud, not public, precise." A pause. "I'm going to make a phone call, then I'm going to find my son." He hung up, because this wasn't just a father responding to a mistake. This was a man who'd seen the same play run for decades, just with better lighting now. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slide. Shakir nodded. "Merrick, from the board. I recognized him from the interviews. He runs half the corporate sponsorships in that building. His name's on the plaque." Shaq's jaw shifted slightly. Shakir went on. "And my name. It was still on the screen. People saw it. I didn't even get erased properly. Just displaced." He chuckled. "Dry. Bitter. I didn't even matter enough to remove." That's when Shaq's heart cracked. Not with rage, but with something more hollow. Powerlessness. Because what do you do when your son is right? When your son sees the system clearer than you wanted him to? When all the legacy and weight you've built can't even protect him from being made to feel invisible? For all his championships, investments, networks, and platforms, For all his status as a cultural icon and father figure to millions, he couldn't stop his own son from being silently stepped over in front of the world. He looked at Shaq here. Not as an athlete, not as a mogul, just as a father. I should have been there, Shaq said low. You were, Shakir replied. You just couldn't be everywhere. Another silence sat between them. Then Shaq stood. Not abruptly, with intention. He didn't say, I'm gonna fix this. He didn't say, I'll make a call. Because that would have been for the cameras. This wasn't that. He turned to Shakir. You come in? Shakir hesitated. Where? To the part they never show on ESPN. They walked back through the service hallway, not through the public path, but through the narrow, dim corridors that led behind the bleachers, through utility doors and boiler rooms, into the skeleton of the building. Shaq's security detail trailed discreetly behind but said nothing. The coordinator tried to intercept them once. Shaq raised a single hand and kept walking. They reached the staff-only operations room, the pulse of the event, where audio engineers, event directors and operations leads debriefed post-show. Most of them didn't even look up when the door opened. They assumed it was another technician. Until Shaq's shadow fell across the whiteboard. The room stilled. A few cell phones went down. Conversations stopped. The lead coordinator looked up, panicked. Mr. O'Neill. Is there something? Shaq didn't raise his voice. He didn't even change his posture. He just stepped inside, glanced around at the room full of professionals in branded polos and lanyards, the people who ran the building from behind the curtain. Then he said one sentence. What you did to my son, you'll feel tomorrow. He let the words hang, let them ache. Then he turned and left. No mic drop, no escalation, just the truth. Heavy and unbending. Behind him, no one moved. Because they knew. They'd forgotten the seat, not the name. And that would cost them more than they realized. Later that night, Shakir sat beside his dad in the back seat of a black SUV, their phones silent between them. The city lights blurred across the tinted windows, like a slow-moving storm. He looked at his father. Gonna go public? Shaq shook his head. Not yet. Why not? Shaq looked forward. Because I don't need the world to scream with me. I need the system to stumble in silence. If they never see it coming, they'll never recover. Shakir nodded slowly, finally understanding. It wasn't about revenge. It was about correction. About not shouting into the noise, but pulling the floor from under the noise itself. And that was something only a father like Shaq could do. The elevator hummed as it climbed toward the upper floors of the Waverly Grand, one of Atlanta's most exclusive high-rises. Shaq stood inside it with Benton and his assistant Julius, both silent, both aware that something was about to shift. The kind of shift that doesn't roar, it rumbles, not public, not loud, just precise, just permanent. When the doors opened into the private penthouse suite, the space was bathed in low amber light from custom floor fixtures. The windows overlooked the city, lights blinking like Morse code far below, as if Atlanta itself knew something had cracked wide open that night. Shaq didn't look out the window. He walked straight to the matte black credenza near the study, opened a lower drawer, and pulled out a sealed manila folder, the kind that held more power than most courtrooms. He placed it on the table, and sat. Julius hesitated. That the file? Shaq nodded. It's time. He slid the folder open. Inside were copies of ownership agreements, capital investment documents, and silent partner memorandums, all connected to Cypress Legacy Group, the private conglomerate that managed the arena. And right there, highlighted in blue marker, was the line Julius had only seen mentioned, but never believed. Shaquille O'Neal. Stakeholder 27. Julius stared. You said it was a minor position. Shaq leaned back. That's what they thought. And that's what made it powerful. He wasn't just a celebrity name on a promo flyer. He wasn't a ribbon-cutting mascot. He was a silent stakeholder with executive pull. A position that by design wasn't publicly attached to him. That way he could move freely. No press leaks, no expectations, no fanfare. He had invested early, when Cypress was first expanding into multi-arena management. At the time it was about long-term legacy, but now it was something else. Now it was leverage. Shaq tapped the folder twice, then opened his phone. He pulled up a secure contacts list and selected a name tagged board chair. CY Press Group. Not gonna be a long call, he told Julius. The call rang once, then connected. Shaka. The voice on the other end answered smoothly. Male. Older. Polished. You know why I'm calling. Shaq said. A pause. Yes, we've seen the footage. Another pause. The board will convene Monday. We can draft a joint. Shaq cut him off. No, not Monday. Not joint. Tonight. A breath. That's irregular. So was removing my son. Shakia. Shaq's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I've kept this silent long enough. You let Merrick's influence rot that building from the inside. Now it's going to be sanitized. Tonight. The man's tone shifted slightly, but his words remained calm. What exactly are you asking for? I'm not asking, Shaq replied. I'm invoking. That word invoking wasn't used often, but it was in the paperwork. A clause reserved for emergency action by minority stakeholders, if ethical compromise or reputational jeopardy was proven. The clause had never been activated in the company's 15-year history. Until now. Julius watched as Shaq laid out the details like chess pieces. First, Shaq said into the phone, the CEO, head of security and the entire event operations team, will be released. Not tomorrow. By dawn. I want confirmation emails sent before sunup. And who will you recommend to replace them? I won't. Let the board do its job. Just not under Merrick's thumb. Silence again. I'll make the call, the chairman said quietly. I already made it, Shaq replied. Then ended the call. He stood, walked over to the sideboard, and poured a glass of water, nothing more. His hands were steady, his breathing calm. Julius stared at him. You really just pulled the floor out from under them? Shaq turned. They pulled it first. I just removed the rug they were hiding under. The city lights outside blinked again. But now they looked different. Now they looked like a warning shot had been fired from above. Shaq wasn't done. He walked over to his laptop, opened a social media draft window, and typed a sentence. No hashtags, no explanation, no taglines, just one clean line. You don't move the future to the back row. He hit post. The internet would do the rest. By 3:12 a.m., it had been retweeted 800. No one needed context. They'd already seen it. The post landed like thunder in a room full of people who thought the storm had passed. Fans woke up to the post, blinking at their screens, then searching for the clip. By the hour, more threads appeared. Analysis of the board documents. Footage reshared. Former employees adding their stories under the post. A current formed. Not outrage. Something more evolved. Something deliberate. Because people weren't just angry. They were watching to see what happened next. And that's when it did. At 6:42 a.m., an anonymous leak to a Sports Insider page confirmed what Shaq already knew. That the CEO of Cypress Legacy Group had stepped down, citing irreconcilable values with the direction of the organization. Minutes later, the head of security issued a statement, retiring from service effective immediately. By 7:10, the game day operations lead had deleted her LinkedIn. The firings weren't loud. No press conferences. No scandalous denials. Just quiet acknowledgments and a sudden vacuum of power. It was surgical. And Shaq said nothing more, because the people who needed to know already knew. Later that morning, Shakir walked into the penthouse with a smoothie in one hand and a quiet look on his face. You didn't have to go nuclear, he said softly. Shaq didn't look up from his coffee. It wasn't nuclear. It was overdue. Shakir placed the smoothie down, then pulled out his phone. You know they're calling it the cleanest takedown in corporate sports history? Shaq sipped. Good. That means they finally started paying attention to the part that matters. Shakir paused, then added, they're saying you set a precedent, that you showed how power should move. Shaq finally looked up. No, he said. I showed them who it should move for. That was the distinction. Because for too long, arenas like that one were treated like kingdoms, with thrones for the few and bleachers for the rest. But Shaq had redrawn the architecture overnight. Quietly, legally, permanent. By noon, reporters were gathering outside Cypress Legacy's headquarters. By evening, the board had called an emergency session. And in the background of it all, the words still echoed. You don't move the future to the back row.
They weren't a quote.
They were a verdict. A sentence passed down not with malice, but with absolute clarity. And this time, the world wasn't just watching. It was learning. By sunrise, the fire was already burning, not with noise or chaos, but with clarity. The clip of Shakir being silently displaced from his seat had now crossed 15 million views across platforms. It was being reposted with hashtags that had started to feel more like movements than slogans. In front row fight, modern Jim Crow, Shakir's seat, News anchors didn't bother recapping the basketball game anymore. No one cared who won. That night wasn't about sports. It had become a reckoning, and the tremors were only growing. Shaq's cryptic post, "You don't move the future to the back row," had triggered a domino effect across every major outlet. Sports networks, political analysts, even civil rights historians were weighing in, dissecting the footage frame by frame. What made it hit harder wasn't the volume of outrage. It was the precision of the injustice. It was so small, so calculated, and so familiar that people couldn't stop watching it because they'd lived it. In corporate boardrooms, PR teams scrambled. At Cypress Legacy headquarters, what was left of the executive branch tried to contain the leak. But it was far too late. Journalists had already dug deeper, and what they found only fed the blaze. A string of anonymous reports started surfacing. Former event workers, ex-security staff, interns, even contracted vendors came forward with eerily similar stories. Not loud, not physical, but chillingly patterned. They spoke of guest lists being subtly restructured last minute, minority staff being reassigned away from VIP zones, and special seating reassignment protocols, used more often than the company admitted. One former employee shared, "We were told never to make a scene, just correct the visual mismatch when needed." They didn't use the word race, but we knew. We all knew. Another posted a screenshot of an internal memo dated 3 years prior, highlighting that appearance consistency in premier seating areas directly impacts sponsor satisfaction metrics. The phrase appearance consistency was picked up and chewed to the bone by public opinion. Meanwhile, the live streamer, Jax, the small-time Twitch content creator, who had unknowingly caught the moment, found himself in the center of a whirlwind. His follower count had tripled in 24 hours. His clip was now featured on CNN, ESPN, and every major digital news outlet. What stunned people even more was that he never meant to make a statement. He was just capturing the vibe of a charity game. But then, something else surfaced. Something that shifted the narrative from explosive to volcanic. An anonymous user leaked a private email chain, showing that a recently terminated event staffer had offered Jax $5,000 to remove the original video. The message was blunt: "Let this die down, and I'll make it worth your time. You're not responsible for the fallout, but you could stop it from spreading." The email was signed with an alias, but metadata confirmed the IP address belonged to the assistant event director, one of the names listed in the overnight terminations. When Jax posted the screenshot with the caption, "So you want to buy my silence? I'm not the one who needs to disappear," the internet went into overdrive. Now it wasn't just a conversation about injustice. It was a cover-up, and cover-ups never stay buried, especially not in a digital world, fueled by real-time receipts. Podcasts dropped emergency episodes. Twitter spaces filled with lawyers, activists, and historians, debating systemic gatekeeping in modern venues. TikTokers reenacted the scene with dramatizations, each one ending with the same tagline, "He didn't leave, he was moved." And just when it seemed the wave had reached its peak, a video surfaced that silenced even the most vocal online critics. It was shaky, shot on a phone, but its voice cut through everything. An elderly black man in a faded ball cap, standing outside the same arena, spoke directly to camera. "My name's Clarence Monroe. I'm 78. In 1969, I came here with my older brother. It wasn't called Cypress Legacy back then, but it stood on the same ground. We were told we couldn't sit in the lower section, that our tickets were a mistake. We were walked out, even though we'd paid full price. I didn't say nothing that day. Just left. Watched the rest of the game through a chain-link fence near the service exit." He paused, voice steady. "This ain't new. It's just got better lighting." That video was shared 2.4 million times in its first 3 hours. It wasn't trending anymore. It was transforming. What began as a single clip had now evolved into a full-scale exposure of the quiet mechanisms that had been in place for decades. The kind no press release ever mentioned. The kind no sponsorship contract ever addressed. Across the city, murals of Shaq began appearing overnight. Not of him dunking or posing, but sitting alone, hood up, seat badge still visible around his neck. One painting on Auburn Avenue added the words, "Our stories don't need stadiums, they need space." Meanwhile, Shaq stayed quiet. He didn't retweet, didn't give a soundbite, didn't step in front of a mic. His silence was strategic, calculated, necessary, because this wasn't about him anymore. It was bigger than a father's anger, bigger than a son's humiliation. It was a mirror, held up to an industry that had long polished its image while letting its roots rot. Cypress Legacy's board released a formal statement by noon. We are initiating a full internal audit of event procedures and historical guest treatment at all affiliated properties. We recognize that policies must reflect not just operational standards, but cultural integrity. Nobody believed the statement would have existed without Shaq's midnight call. Still, the message landed. In the following days, other arenas across the country began revisiting their VIP practices. A leaked meeting recording from an unnamed stadium revealed executives scrambling to scrub guest protocols, some even considering removing VIP rows entirely for select events. The ripple effect was real. The conversation was permanent, and none of it came with broken glass or burning signs. No boycotts, no riots, just truth, structure, and receipts. That was the twist no one saw coming. That this revolution didn't need fire. It needed focus. By the end of the week, Jax had turned his Twitch channel into a daily digest of civil rights in sports venues. Clarence Monroe had been invited to speak at several universities. Shakir's DM inbox was filled with messages from kids who said they had sat in classrooms, lunch tables, and offices where they too had been moved without being seen. And still the post remained unchanged, unedited. You don't move the future to the back row. It wasn't just a clapback. It had become a compass, and the world was now pointing toward it. Game night returned to Cypress Legacy Arena, but it didn't feel the same. The walls still stood, the lights still flashed, the floor still gleamed, but the energy had changed. It was no longer owned by the building. It was owned by the people walking in. There were no signs, no chants, no cardboard fists raised in the air. Just jerseys, thousands of them. Black, crisp, clean, and printed with a single number. From the parking lot to the upper concourse, the number echoed like a quiet storm. On the back of toddlers, on the shoulders of high schoolers, on the chests of grandmothers. Some were custom printed, others written with silver Sharpie on plain tees, but every one of them carried the same message. I saw what you did, and I won't unsee it. Security didn't ask questions. They couldn't. No one was shouting. No one was pushing. No one was breaking anything. They were just there, flooding the space with calm. As fans filtered in, the usual VIP zone near courtside looked different. The seats were there, cushions fluffed, name tags still attached. But one by one, fans who'd been upgraded to front rows stood beside the seats instead of sitting. Some simply placed their 1A jersey on the cushion and moved back 3 rows. Some left notes. One seat had a folded piece of paper with a child's handwriting. This one's not for sale. The protest wasn't explosive. It was composed. And that's what made it impossible to ignore. From the skybox, Shaq watched quietly, his arms crossed, face unreadable. He wasn't mic'd up. He wasn't posing. He hadn't released a statement since the night of the post. All he did was show up. But he didn't sit in the glass suite reserved for investors. Instead, he stood behind the row of chairs, letting others take the seats meant for him. The camera caught a glimpse of him during warm-ups, but the announcers didn't mention it. They didn't need to. The story was already writing itself. And then came the twist no one predicted. Across the country, at a college basketball game in New Jersey, a group of students arrived wearing white polos, with 1A stitched in black thread. No noise, just presence. At a prep school gala in Chicago, a youth choir sang while wearing robes with the number pressed over their hearts. In Portland, a high school principal issued a new policy: VIP school assembly seating would now rotate among students, chosen anonymously, to prevent legacy bias. The phrase that kept resurfacing, not from politicians or commentators, but from everyday people, was this: who gets to sit in the front? It was no longer about basketball. It had turned into a question society couldn't unask. Church pews, graduation rows, workplace meetings, award galas. The quiet hierarchy of space. Who was seen first, heard first, protected first, was now under a new lens. And none of it was organized. No movement leader, no fundraising arm. Just momentum built off the back of a moment that felt too familiar to ignore. Back at Cypress Legacy, the arena's social media manager had been instructed to acknowledge community response. Their tweet read, "We honor the voices that remind us where the real court lies, in the hearts of our fans." It backfired. People weren't looking for polished responses anymore. They were looking for reckoning. Inside the locker rooms, players talked less about post-game stats and more about the front row optics. "We've all seen it," one veteran said in a leaked voice memo. We've been the ones walked around, not toward. It just took a kid like Shaq for folks to finally pay attention. The memo made the rounds. So did the change. Within a week, 5 other major arenas announced new policies around VIP accessibility, requiring rotating passes for community youth programs. Sponsorship reps protested, citing visibility concerns. But the teams pushed forward. The pressure wasn't external anymore, it was internal. Even the NFL took note. At a preseason media event, several players arrived wearing custom cleats marked with 1A etched into the side in matte black. The symbolism wasn't explained. It didn't have to be. And through it all, Shaq stayed quiet. He turned down every interview, skipped every talk show invitation. When ESPN offered him an hour-long special, he declined with 5 words, "I'm not the story here." Instead, he spent time with Shaq. They weren't planning statements or curating image. They were just father and son again, this time with the world adjusting around them instead of the other way around. In a rare off-camera moment, Shaq told his inner circle, "They think this is about a seat. It's about the silence that comes with being told you don't deserve one. That's what we pulled the plug on." He was right. Because the conversation had shifted in a way that couldn't be charted by trending algorithms or press kits. It had moved into the subtle structure of how space is given, withheld, and explained away. It had become a mirror, not a march. And when people saw themselves in that mirror, saw the way they'd been shuffled, redirected, or skipped over, they started doing something more powerful than protesting. They stayed standing. Back at the next Cyprus game, the stadium's PA system did something new. Just before player introductions, a soft voice came through the speakers. It was Clarence Monroe, the 78-year-old who had posted the video about being removed from the same arena back in 19. His voice was pre-recorded, smooth and full of time. Tonight no one gets moved for looking like the past. Tonight, the future stays seated. As his voice faded, the arena dimmed for a heartbeat, then roared to life. And this time, when the camera panned to Shaq in the stands, sitting exactly where his ticket had first placed him, the crowd didn't just cheer. They stood, all of them, front row to nosebleeds, not to make noise, but to make space. It arrived quietly, a thin white envelope, tucked between a stack of sports mailers and brand endorsement proposals. Shaq almost missed it. The return address was handwritten, and the name in the top corner wasn't familiar. Tanner Well. Nothing official, no logos, no university crest, no marketing gloss. Just a plain envelope, sealed with too much tape, like the sender wanted to make sure the words inside didn't escape before they were read. Shaq peeled it open at the kitchen counter without much thought, expecting another stranger's opinion about something they'd only half understood. But the first line stopped him cold. "You don't know me, but I was in the seat that used to be yours." He set the letter down, sat slowly, and read the rest in silence. "My name is Tanner. I'm 18. My parents were the guests of someone powerful that night. I didn't even ask who. They told me to dress nice, show up and not say anything stupid. I sat in seat 1A. I saw you get up. I saw them move you. And I didn't say anything." Shaq blinked. The words were messy, written in heavy ink like the pen had been pressed too hard. Some letters had scratch-outs, but the emotion was clean, awkward, raw, and not rehearsed. "I kept telling myself maybe it was just a mistake. Maybe you wanted to sit somewhere else. But I knew better. I knew I was in the wrong seat, even if nobody else around me seemed to care. And I didn't do anything. That's the part I can't shake." The letter didn't ask for forgiveness. It didn't try to explain the politics behind the decision. Tanner never mentioned Merrick by name. Instead, he kept the focus squarely on himself, on the silence, the inaction, the complicity. "I didn't ask to sit there, but I also didn't ask what it cost you." That line hit different. Shaq leaned back in his chair and read it again. Slower this time. Not because he needed clarity, but because he could feel the weight Tanner was trying to carry, and it wasn't performative. It wasn't a social media apology drafted by a crisis manager. It was a teenager realizing, too late, that proximity to power can rot you if you let it go unchecked. There was a second item folded inside the letter. Something stiff, laminated, creased once through the middle. Shaq pulled it out. A courtside credential. The same one issued to every high-profile guest that night. Tanner's name was scrawled in marker along the back, next to a digital timestamp and an official seal. But someone, probably Tanner himself, had drawn a line through his name with permanent ink and scribbled over it, This pass didn't get me closer to the game. It got me farther from who I want to be. On the back of the letter, written in smaller, tighter handwriting, was one final line. Do me a favor. Burn it. I don't want it in my house anymore. I don't want to forget. I just want to be better. Shakir sat with it for a long time. Not because he was angry, but because he wasn't. He understood. He had felt that same silence before. He had seen it in school hallways, in staff meetings, in locker room glances. The look of someone who knew but didn't move. And he knew what it took to come back from that. Not a headline, not a public confession, but a personal one, handwritten, unedited, full of stumbles. Later that night, he walked into the backyard with the letter, the pass, and a lighter. He didn't make a speech, didn't record it for social media. He just lit the edge of the laminated pass and held it over a ceramic bowl his grandmother once used for planting roses. The plastic curled. The edges blackened. The text disappeared. When the flame reached the corner of the letter, he paused. Just for a second. Not because he was second-guessing it. Because he realized what it meant to carry guilt that didn't belong to you, but still needed to pass through you before it could leave the world. He let the page go. The flame took it gently. And for the first time in weeks, the weight on his chest let go. Not all the way, but enough. 6 months passed like a slow breath, after a long run, not rushed, not forgotten. Just counted in the quiet rebuilding of something that had cracked wide open. The arena looked the same from the outside. The signage was still bold. The digital banners still rotated their glowing messages. But inside, everything had changed. Cyprus Legacy Arena was reopening not just after cosmetic renovation, it was reopening with a statement carved into its design. The original VIP section, once cloaked in exclusivity and silent hierarchy, was gone. In its place, front row center, now stood a new section with a name that didn't come from a corporation or a donor plaque. It was called Shakir Row. 12 seats, not gold-trimmed or velvet-lined, just clean, firm, and intentional. Their backs etched with a single line in silver. No voice too quiet. No presence too small. They weren't reserved for celebrity guests, business executives, or political figures. These seats belonged to a different kind of elite. Young leaders from overlooked neighborhoods, schools, and shelters, nominated not by title but by community. Each game, new kids would sit there. Some wore blazers. Some wore hoodies. Some brought notebooks, sketch pads, or earbuds. But they all wore one unspoken truth: you belong here. Opening night arrived without overblown fanfare. No fireworks. No pre-game hype packages. Instead, the lights came up soft, and the Jumbotron showed a silent montage. Kids arriving in vans, escorted by youth coordinators, walking down the tunnel, eyes wide. And among them, Shakir O'Neal, now 6 months older, a little taller, hair grown out slightly, sat near the center of the row. No jersey, no name tag, just a plain navy windbreaker, and a calm smile that said, "I'm good. I'm here." He didn't wave to the camera when it panned to him. He didn't have to. The crowd saw him, and this time, they stood without being told. Up in the suite level, Shaq watched from the shadows behind the glass. He stood alone for a moment, sipping water, eyes locked on the row that now bore his son's name. Not in spotlight, but in permanence. Julius stood a few paces behind him, phone buzzing constantly from national press still asking for post-game comments. Shaq ignored it. "You ready for this to die down?" Julius asked softly. Shaq didn't blink. "It was never supposed to live for me." The house lights dimmed. The game tipped off. But it wasn't what was happening on the court that mattered. It was the energy off it. It felt clean, like something toxic had been aired out, like something that had always been wrong had finally been recognized. But the real twist didn't arrive in a press conference or media drop. It came in the form of a leak, not scandalous, not dramatic, just a notice of resignation quietly filed and time-stamped 3 months earlier, now uncovered by an investigative journalist looking into executive transitions at Merrick Holdings. The name on the form, Clayton Merrick. Effective date, 90 days ago. Stated reason, reprioritizing philanthropic focus. It would have ended there. Just a quiet departure from a man the world had long associated with elitism and coded policy. But there was more. The same journalist traced anonymous donations made to multiple anti-racism education programs, small nonprofits, and equity training initiatives, launched in underfunded high schools across the Midwest and South. The checks came from a private trust named Row 1 Foundation, established just a month after the Shakir incident. When pressed, none of the programs would confirm the donor. But one school principal in Baton Rouge, speaking off record, said, "We received our largest ever single donation. It came with no branding, but there was a typed note. Just said, not trying to fix the past, just trying not to hide from it anymore." The internet didn't take long to piece it together. Neither did the public. Within 24 hours, Merrick's name was trending again. But this time, not in fury, in disbelief. That even he, the man at the center of the displacement, had shifted, not erased, not excused, but moved. When a reporter asked Shaq about the revelation during a brief hallway encounter, he gave a short nod and replied, "People change when the mirror gets too honest to ignore." He walked off before they could ask another question. Back in the arena, halftime brought no entertainment acts. Instead, a lone spotlight hit Row 1, where each young person stood, introduced by name, their school or community group read aloud. One was a robotics team captain from a Detroit public school. Another, a poetry champion from rural Alabama. A third, a teen mom graduating early from her continuation school. When they sat, the arena clapped, not out of charity, not out of obligation, but because this time, the front row finally looked like the future. Shakir leaned over to the boy next to him, maybe 14 years old, eyes wide and knees bouncing with nerves. The kid whispered something, and Shakir chuckled, nodded, and offered a fist bump. No cameras caught the moment clearly, but a still photo, snapped from section 103, caught just enough of the gesture. Shakir turning slightly, fist out, expression open to go viral within an hour. The caption someone added underneath, "He didn't reclaim the seat. He shared it." The next morning, newspapers ran quiet covers. One paper had only 3 words stretched over a full front page. "Now, everyone sees," because that's what had really shifted. Not just policies, not just seating charts, but sightlines. The lens through which people viewed equity had moved. And now, with Shakir Row carved into the blueprint of a billion-dollar building, it was harder to pretend certain people didn't belong up front. Later that week, Shakir received another letter. No credential inside. No guilt, either. Just a note from a girl in Philadelphia. "I don't want to be famous. I just want to sit where I don't have to prove I deserve to." He pinned it on his bedroom wall. Not next to trophies or headlines, just above his desk, where it could remind him that this wasn't a season. It was a standard. That same night, as the city hummed beneath him, Shaq stood on his balcony overlooking the skyline, phone buzzing again in his pocket. He let it go to voicemail, then pulled out a pen and wrote something on the back of an envelope. He wrote it not for publication, not for speeches, just for himself. This wasn't about a seat, it was about a signal, and now the whole world's tuned in. And with that, he turned out the balcony light, because the message had already reached every row. If this story made you pause, don't rush to react. Reflect, look around your own front rows, ask who's missing. Ask why. Then don't just make space. Protect it. Because sometimes, the smallest seat holds the loudest truth.